Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Good. Hi everyone, I'm Rainey, final year PhD student at Open Lab, Newcastle University, and today I'll be presenting our paper about Gabber, which is a digital platform that's been iteratively designed and developed to make qualitative practices more participatory and accessible for everyday people. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my co-authors for contributing to this project in various ways, and the EPSRC for funding this research. So to design Gabber, first we need to understand the existing qualitative practices of ourselves as professional researchers, but also as non-experts who engage in these qualitative practices. We frame the qualitative workflow as 5 phases, where we make multiple decisions at each. Typically, we start with an idea and prepare a study to explore this idea. At this point, we often already know the types of data that we should collect, the methods we plan to use to analyse this data, and can already begin sort of creating an outline for our next sort of report. Of course, there are many different approaches to qualitative data capture and analysis, but broadly speaking, there's no standardised process for how we handle data captured or produced as a result of our research, and instead it's something that we learn through experience, which also makes teaching it quite challenging. Increasingly, people outside of academia want to collect and analyse qualitative data, such as for capturing and understanding users' experiences of a service. In our paper, we call this population non-experts of qualitative practices, or non-experts for short, as they are not necessarily trained or experienced with qualitative practices, but are already engaging to some extent with this in some way. While there are already existing practices for capturing qualitative data by non-experts, the expertise, time and cost associated with analysing this data and reporting findings and insights from this limits participation and engagement with sort of this analysis and this reporting phase. This means that this rich and potentially meaningful data that's being captured by these non-experts is not being used. In our experience working with non-experts, the goal for them has been to collect evidence that they can use to answer questions that they have and to shape a narrative around the problem that they are personally experiencing. So, for example, to contest local government decisions. But in order for data that they collect and analyse to be meaningful and representative of the communities which they collect this data from, there needs to be rigour in their processes for such stakeholders, like local government, to take this data seriously. Ultimately, this is what we do with our research, right? But we have lots of layers of institutionalised processes to support rigour and to guide our workflow. So, for example, by submitting documents to ethics boards to guide and regulate our work. Of course, what we consider as rigour is very different to what non-experts would, but ultimately it's about documenting decisions through this qualitative process. So with that in mind, we wanted to understand the existing qualitative practices of non-experts, the main challenges they experience in their qualitative workflow, and to apply the design learning to create technologies to support these non-experts engaging in more accessible and participatory qualitative practices. So to do this, we undertook 3 case studies in different contexts with non-experts who were either interested in or actively engaging in qualitative practices. Each case study examined different aspects of the qualitative workflow and built on learning from the previous. We document each of these in detail in the paper, but today I'll focus on one of the 3 case studies, which was both the longest and richest in terms of design, learning, and output to refine Gabber of those 3 engagements. So in our case study, we work with a charity organisation in the northeast of England that works with people who are often excluded from the support and services they need and experience a combination of homelessness, reoffending, substance misuse and mental ill health. This combination of at least 3 of these factors is known as complex needs, and these people are often the most vulnerable and difficult to reach in regards to service support. This organisation also delivers training on complex needs and reflective practice to external organisations in this sector across the United Kingdom to help those services have a better understanding of their shared service users. This organisation captures and uses audio interviews with service users, so those people with complex needs, to document their journey through life and what they're experiencing now with complex needs, and uses those audio recordings in training sessions to support reflective discussions around the lived experience of those people. So sort of our research focus in this particular case study was how the trainer selects content and how it's used within training was something that we were very interested in learning more about. Prior to our collaboration, this organisation's existing qualitative workflow was undertaken by one individual. It was also the same person who delivered training. So this person drove that whole process within the organisation. Data collection consisted of this person capturing interviews with service users, listening to the conversations they captured using specialised post-production software, and essentially selected the bits that they thought were most interesting, creating the new audio recording and using that to drive these reflective discussions within their training sessions. As this complete qualitative workflow was only undertaken by one person, the same type of content was being chosen, and it took extensive time outside of their work hours to engage in this process. But most importantly, this excluded other staff and service users who could have benefited from engaging in this process. Through our collaboration, the organisation wanted to make their existing process more accessible and engaging for more staff and service users. To explore this, we observed their existing working practices, their end-to-end process and held design activities in some phases of the qualitative workflow to better understand their existing practices, and designed digital prototypes to understand how technology might augment this process. For data collection and analysis, we deployed a prototype to streamline data handling and consent to simplify accessing and analysing captured recordings. Our prototype helps service users and staff listen to conversations, create comments on that media in response to content, which opened up conversations within this organisation. Like I said, our research focus on this, with this case study, was on the reporting phase. We wanted to understand how the trainer could select meaningful content and ways in which we could streamline that process. So we held the Wizard of Oz activity, where the trainer created a timeline from all the commented media to sort of create a new recording that they could use within a training session. So that's broadly how we configured this collaboration. And as I mentioned before, our findings in design learning were iterative and came through our 3 sort of in the wild case studies. And learning from each of those fed into the following. But today I'd like to highlight some qualitative findings from each phase of the specific case study in relation to aspects of the qualitative workflow. So during data collection, service users often reveal confidential, personal, and incriminating details, which raise concerns from the organisation about whether these conversations could genuinely be reused or shared with other services, which was the current practice when delivering training. A few weeks after capturing one of the conversations, one of the participants relapsed, which made staff reluctant to use this recording during the analysis process, which prompted the organisation to ask us to hide it for view within the prototype. These challenges highlight how non-experts' management of consent is very different to our professional consent practices. And with the introduction of GDPR, non-experts now are more aware of how data they capture is stored and processed out of fear of what could happen if they do that wrong. During the Wizard of Oz activity, where the trainer selected content to highlight experiences from service users to use in training, the trainer mostly selected content that they had previously listened to and commented on. This selection of data represented only the views of the trainer, rather than representing content that was highlighted by staff and service users who had previously engaged and contributed to this analysis phase. So how data is selected and to represent findings could have an impact on engagement with this process in the future, as those who contributed to the process by commenting may see their participation as being quite tokenistic, and because of that they won't engage in this process again. What I'd like to do now is show you the platform that we developed through the design learning from across our 3 case studies, which we have called Gabber. We go into a lot more detail about this in the paper and how it was sort of iteratively refined across those 3 in the wild case studies. So let's walk through the end-to-end sort of qualitative workflow for non-experts using Gabber. So through the Gabber website, you can create a project which stores conversations about a specific theme of interest. In this case, it's understanding complex needs. You can then select or upload an image, which is used to identify your project alongside its name. You can then configure topics to structure data collection, which then map to how Gabber processes and represents recordings. To structure data analysis, you can optionally add a codebook, which then appears when commenting on recordings during the analysis phase. So Gabber, right from this preparation phase, is making non-experts consider how they will work with the data and puts in place a hidden professional layer for handling and consenting of the data. We find that qualitative data often captured by non-experts through their mobile devices, but there's no common practice for how data is captured and managed. The Gabber mobile application aims to streamline this. It lists projects, their associated questions, which we just created, and is designed as a lightweight way to capture structured conversations around a project of interest. In Gabber, you then select who's involved in the conversation, how they consent as a group for this recording to be used, and then you have your recording. Tapping question tags the recording, and then that's used whenever it's represented on the website. But we saw through our case studies that consent was a key tension point for our collaborators, particularly when reusing content. And with the introduction of GDPR, how data is managed was a concern from all of our collaborators. In Gabber, we embedded an informed consent process as a simple way to access and update how participants want their data and their recording to be used. There's also an embargo period, which is quite familiar to ourselves, as a way for participants to have freedom and access over this data for a configurable period. In our case, it's the first 24 hours. Then after that, it's available to other people within the project. What we've done here is leverage our professionalized practices, informed consent, data embargoes, and embedded those in Gabber so non-experts adhere to data regulations while not having to overthink or think too much about those practices. In Gabber, the conversation is uploaded from the mobile device and it appears on the website. Anyone involved in the discussion, of course, depending on the consent that was agreed upon when doing the interview, can listen to this conversation. Gabber uses the original media that was captured to simplify engagement for data analysis and when reporting findings as a way to lower barriers non-experts typically experience who are engaging with these phases. Commenting and tagging are used for data analysis as a lightweight, hands-on approach for highlighting content that is of interest to non-experts. Reporting findings is another key challenge for non-experts who want to meaningfully use the experience they collect to evidence insights. Informed by how audio recordings were previously being curated in our experience working with non-experts and the familiarity of playlist interfaces, we developed a lightweight way to use the raw, highlighted, coded segments of data to create a playlist that could be used to facilitate in-person discussions, such as for use in training. This makes the reporting phase an accessible and experientially rich way to share insights compared to, for example, a written report. So I've described one case study today and some findings from this. We described two other case studies in our paper that informed iterations of Gabber. Since then, Gabber has been deployed in several other contexts, ranging from global future forecasting activities with the International Federation for Red Cross Red Crescent to understand their experiences and challenges of volunteers globally to inform their strategy development within the organisation. Gabber has also been used not by non-experts, but by researchers with communities that they work with to capture and analyse feedback in the delivery of training to perpetrators of domestic violence to iteratively inform the refinement of the delivery of this training. This has also been published in Communities and Technologies recently, so if you're curious as to how Gabber has been applied by researchers, I'd highly recommend giving that a read. But as you can see, a theme across at least the three case studies in our paper is people that are engaging in those qualitative practices. What we're curious and interested in now is working with people who are not necessarily engaging in those now, but would benefit from that in some way. And I'm sure there are other ways where Gabber could benefit yourself or the communities that you're working with. So I'd love to hear more about some of the ideas you have for where Gabber might be applied in your own research or those that you're working with. And thanks very much for your time. If you want to know more about Gabber and how it's been used in the other sort of case studies, recommend reading the paper. But you can give it a go. It's a website, gabber.audio, where you can listen to conversations that have been recorded. You can download the apps and give it a go yourself, create projects and see how it works, really. It's free, it's open source. You can check it out on GitHub if that's sort of piques your interest. And again, I'd like to thank my co-authors for contributing to this project in various ways. And that's everything.
We are happy to take questions now. Okay, I'll start with one. Can you tell us about some limitations of Gabber, as in how experts might do better compared to how Gabber performs right now?
Yeah, so because Gabber has been designed for non-experts, it means that professionals could pick it up and use it to sort of undertake some aspects of their research. But generally, they also do lots of other things which Gabber doesn't do. So, for example, researchers typically would transcribe the data and make sense of that and encode that. And we all have our own processes, right? So Gabber's been designed to work directly with the audio. So that's an advantage of Gabber, but perhaps a limitation depending on how you do your own research. Right. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, Dan Cosley at Cornell, and I'll remind everyone that it's really cool to ask questions. So I'm looking at the title here about supporting voice, right? And it really, I mean, there's some elements that sort of look really straight up for that, right? So sort of consent, trying to think about participant rights to the data, thinking about the regulations. But I didn't actually hear that come out. And normally when I hear supporting voice, I'd think of like the participants, right? The person speaking in their own voice. And here it's almost like you're trying to get the voices of these sort of, domain but non-coding experts. And so I'd just like to hear you say a little more about this voice and how you were thinking about it and how it ramifies into the tool design decisions.
Yeah. So voice is key to Gabber. It's not that the people who create projects are capturing voice so that they can use it, but rather the people that are parts of Gabber projects are those who are doing that qualitative sort of social science type research. In Gabber, voice is I think, well, we talk about it in the paper, it's the most nuanced and interesting, for me, sort of media, and it's also underused quite a lot in research, particularly within the CHI community, and it's something that non-experts are already using to sort of demonstrate the lived experience of people that they work with. So throughout this Gabber process, we could have sort of used transcriptions and come up with cool ways in which they could have coded that data, but we wanted to keep voice. As soon as we capture it, use that voice to make sense of it, and then use voice again as a way to sort of share meaning and insight. That richness is something that we're trying to keep out throughout this process.
Okay, I think I just then fundamentally misunderstood what you meant by voice. Right?
Okay.
I'm hearing, the way you're talking about, I'm hearing like audio, directly audio. I'm hearing voice in the sense that people use it, like making sure participants are heard, making sure all stakeholders are heard, right?
Yeah.
And are you meaning it in both ways, or are you really sort of meaning it?
I think possibly that's a bit trickier, because then that depends upon how the organisation or community configures Gabber and engages those different stakeholders. Because, of course, if you're engaging with a particular community, you might not necessarily represent particular people's voices in that community. So it's a tricky one. I think our angle is more voice as a way to sort of demonstrate the richness and nuance of what people are talking about, rather than what you're saying. But I'd love to chat more about that afterwards if you're around. Thanks, Dan.
We have time for more questions. I have another one. It's interesting that you added the informed consent aspect to your platform.
Yeah.
And from the examples shown, you just have like two options, like where everyone can use the data and where only the researchers can.
Yeah.
Do you plan to add like more fine-grained?
Yeah, so there's three options. So whenever you create a project, you can create it as being public. So, for example, anyone in the world can engage with that content, or private, where it's only those who are members of the project. But the consent option that appears within the mobile application is that anyone can have access to it, just members of that project, so that it's private, right? Or just you and I, if you and I are having a conversation right now. Right. And how the consent works is actually it's critical within Gabber. If you and I have a conversation, we will agree now, as a group, that we want the public to see it. But afterwards, we get an email which is sort of related to the embargo period, and we can update our consent individually, because you might say something and think, oh, actually, I didn't want to say that. I don't want the public to listen to that. Right. And you've got those three options where you can say, actually, I only want me to have access to that recorder, basically. There's another option where you can request for it to be deleted, of course, but that's a bit trickier because I'm part of it, so perhaps I don't want it to be deleted, right?
My question was, do you plan to add like more fine-grained consent options to the platform?
So I think that's tricky because it could just get out of hand, right? You could just add fine-grained options for everyone's particular sorts of needs and then make it so configurable that, yeah, I think it's certainly possible, but it's not something that we've looked at currently. Through our three case studies, particularly within the sort of sensitive context, consent was key, and it was those options that we sort of guided towards through working with these organizations. Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.